At dawn on June 6, 1944, parachutes filled the skies over Normandy. As soldiers of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division landed in flooded fields, a small stone church in Angoville-au-Plain still held its cross on the spire. Explosions echoed all around, barns burned, and the village trembled, but inside those walls, a different kind of battle was about to begin. When 2 American medics stepped through the doors, the church became the only place where the guns fell silent. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the first light of the invasion spread across the flooded fields of Normandy. The air was heavy with the smell of seawater, smoke, and burning fuel. Around the small village of Angoville-au-Plain, paratroopers of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division dropped into darkness and chaos. Many landed far from their intended zones, crashing through orchards, hedgerows, and irrigation ditches that had been deliberately flooded by the Germans. Some drowned in the cold water before ever touching land. Others crawled through the mud, disoriented, clutching their rifles and medical kits, surrounded by sounds that blurred the line between battle and storm. The village lay between the key causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. Its stone church, built in the 12th century, stood at the center, a small Romanesque structure of gray limestone that had survived centuries of wars and weather. Its roof tiles were chipped by shrapnel, and its stained glass windows had long been shattered. Yet its bell tower still stood, crowned by a simple iron cross that caught the light of the burning horizon. The fields around it were littered with parachutes, weapons, and the bodies of men who had fallen too fast or too low. For hours, Angoville-au-Plain was no more than a crossroads in a battlefield. German troops of the 91st Air Landing Division and American paratroopers clashed in the hedgerows, firing blindly through the fog. Mortar rounds fell close to the church, shaking its ancient walls and scattering fragments of stone across the pews. Horses bolted from nearby barns, carts overturned, and the sound of machine guns echoed between the trees. No one in the village could tell who held the ground. It was a night where maps lost meaning, and survival depended only on instinct. Through that chaos, 2 American medics, Private First Class Kenneth J. Moore and Sergeant Robert E. Wright, moved toward the church. They carried what little medical equipment had survived the drop: a few bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syringes, and plasma bottles wrapped in cloth. They were not looking for cover or victory. They were looking for shelter, for a place that could serve as more than just a ruin. The stone church was intact enough to stand against artillery, large enough to hold the wounded, and close enough to the fighting that the injured could be carried inside before bleeding out in the fields. When they entered, the air inside was thick with dust and candle smoke. The floor was strewn with debris, but the nave was still open, lit by the dull glow of dawn filtering through broken windows. It was quiet, eerily so compared to the thunder outside. They began clearing space between the pews, dragging aside fallen wood and fragments of glass. The altar still stood beneath a cracked archway, a reminder of peace in a morning that had forgotten it. The medics did not speak, they simply worked, preparing a sanctuary that would soon fill with the noise of pain and effort, with the pulse of life struggling against war. As the first wounded were brought in, paratroopers, civilians, and even a German soldier, the church transformed. The space that had once echoed with hymns now filled with groans and whispered prayers. Outside, the battle for Normandy raged on, but within those medieval walls something different began. Amid fire and ruin, the church of Angoville-au-Plain became a place where the rules of war briefly yielded to the simple, fragile duty to heal. Every detail of that dawn, the sound of boots on wet stone, the flicker of light on blood-stained pews, the silence between explosions, would linger in memory long after the invasion was over. It was the moment when 2 men, surrounded by destruction, decided that saving a life was as vital as taking ground. And in that choice, a forgotten village church became one of the few places in Normandy where humanity itself held the line. Normandy met the American airborne with confusion and fragmentation rather than order or control. The invasion had been planned with precision, but war rarely obeyed plans. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the low clouds, strong winds, and relentless German anti-aircraft fire scattered the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division across the flooded countryside. What was meant to be a coordinated drop became a chaotic descent into darkness. Entire sticks of men landed miles from their intended zones. Some drifted into enemy-held villages, others into fields turned into shallow lakes by the Germans' deliberate flooding of the Douve River valley. Parachutes snagged on trees, hedgerows, and church steeples. Men hung helplessly above the ground, their silhouettes illuminated by tracer fire. Communication was the first casualty. Radios were lost in the water or destroyed upon impact. Commanders could not find their companies. Medics could not find their supply bundles. The units that had trained for months to operate with surgical precision were suddenly reduced to small, disjointed groups of survivors trying to orient themselves by the flashes of distant gunfire. The hedgerows that defined the Norman landscape turned into natural traps, walls of earth and vegetation that blocked movement, line of sight, and coordination. Every field became a separate battlefield, isolated from the others by centuries-old farm walls. For the medics, the chaos was even more merciless. They had jumped carrying limited equipment, a pack of bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, and a few bottles of plasma. The rest had been packed into supply canisters that were supposed to land nearby, marked with red panels. But most of those canisters were lost in the darkness, sinking into flooded meadows or captured by German patrols. Without stretchers, litters, or vehicles, every evacuation had to be done by hand, one wounded man at a time, carried through mud and ditches under fire. The first casualties appeared within minutes of landing. Many paratroopers were injured before they even engaged the enemy. Broken legs, twisted ankles, shattered ribs from hard landings. Others were hit during descent by machine gun bursts or flak fragments. In the confusion, wounded soldiers crawled into ditches and barns, calling out for help that did not come. The fields echoed not with commands, but with isolated cries, drowned out by artillery. Some men bled out in silence because no one could reach them in time. The German defenders, belonging to the 91st Air Landing Division and various static coastal units, were equally disoriented but held the advantage of terrain. They fired from farmhouses, crossroads, and hedgerows, turning every movement into a risk. Medical evacuation routes did not exist. Every attempt to retrieve the wounded was a gamble between duty and survival. The road to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and the causeways from Utah Beach were choked with wreckage and enemy fire, making it impossible to send the injured back to the shore. In this landscape of confusion, the concept of organized medical care broke down completely. There were no established aid stations, no secure perimeters, and no chain of command to direct the flow of casualties. The airborne operation had dropped the medics deep behind enemy lines, with no hope of reinforcement until the beachheads were secured. Field hospitals, which were supposed to follow the advance, were still miles away, unable to cross the flooded lowlands. Every house, barn, or church that still stood became a potential shelter, a place where the living might cling to life for a few more hours. The problem was not simply a lack of medicine, it was the absence of stability. The invasion's success depended on momentum, but healing required stillness. The men who had been trained to leap from planes and move fast now faced the slow, agonizing work of keeping others alive without the tools they needed. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where maps failed and units vanished into the fog, the difference between life and death came down to luck, improvisation, and the courage of those who refused to leave the wounded behind. The village of Angoville-au-Plain lay in the lowlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, just a few kilometers south of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first towns liberated by American paratroopers on D-Day. It was a quiet agricultural community before the war, surrounded by apple orchards, hedgerows, and narrow dirt roads that wound between stone farmhouses. In 1944 it counted fewer than 200 inhabitants. The land was flat and open toward the Douve River, whose floodplain the Germans had deliberately inundated to hinder airborne landings. The village itself sat on slightly higher ground, making it one of the few dry points amid miles of marshes and flooded meadows. This topography gave it tactical importance. It overlooked the causeways that connected Utah Beach to the interior of Normandy. During the German occupation, Angoville-au-Plain fell within a defensive network controlled by the 91st Luftland Division and the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. These were experienced troops, veterans of Italy and the Eastern Front, stationed in small garrisons and farmhouses. They reinforced the area with machine gun nests and mortars, using the dense bocage as natural cover. The roads leading to the village were narrow and easily blocked. Any force attempting to advance inland from the beaches would have to pass through this maze. At the center of the village stood its church, dedicated to Saints Côme and Damien, the patron saints of physicians. Built in the 12th century from local limestone, the structure embodied the solidity of medieval craftsmanship. Its thick Romanesque walls and low-arched roof had endured centuries of storms, revolutions, and wars. Inside, the nave was simple: wooden pews, a modest altar, and small stained-glass windows that filtered the Norman light into subdued colors. The bell tower, square and heavy, was visible from every approach road. It had been a place of worship for generations and a landmark for travelers long before it became part of a battlefield. In the spring of 1944, as German engineers prepared the region for defense, the church remained one of the few intact stone buildings within reach of the marshlands. While surrounding barns were fortified or destroyed, the villagers preserved the church as best they could, storing supplies in its cellar, and sometimes using it as a shelter during air raids. By June it had already suffered minor damage from stray bombs, but it still stood, its roof partially broken, its windows shattered, yet its structure unshaken. When the night of June 5 turned into the dawn of June 6, the world around Angoville changed forever. The sound of aircraft filled the sky. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes crossed overhead, dropping paratroopers and equipment into the fields below. The Germans opened fire from the ground, their tracers crisscrossing the clouds. In the confusion, men of the 101st Airborne Division descended into the area, many landing directly around Angoville-au-Plain. The Germans immediately counterattacked, and the village became contested ground. The church, still standing amid the chaos, offered the only solid shelter in sight. For the 2 American medics who would soon arrive there, the setting held both danger and opportunity. The village's location placed it directly between the scattered elements of the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments. The church's thick stone walls could withstand small arms fire and shrapnel, and its open floor could accommodate dozens of wounded. Most importantly, it was visible, a fixed point in a landscape where direction and order had vanished. Its symbolic weight also mattered. In a countryside torn apart by invasion, the image of a church still standing carried an unspoken message: even amid destruction, some things could endure. As the morning wore on, fighting spread across the hedgerows. American paratroopers pushed north toward St. Mireglise and south toward the causeways leading to Utah Beach. German forces regrouped and counterattacked through the fields, and shells fell ever closer to the village. The people of Angoville hid in their cellars as bullets shattered doors and roofs. Yet through it all, the Church of Saints Côme and Damien remained standing, scarred but whole. Its medieval stones would soon bear witness to one of the quietest and most human moments of the entire Normandy campaign. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as the battle for Normandy unfolded with chaos and uncertainty, 2 American paratrooper medics, Kenneth J. Moore and Robert E. Wright of the 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, moved cautiously through the fields south of St. Mireglise. Both had landed separately from their units during the scattered night drop. Their mission was not to fight but to save lives, yet even that task seemed impossible amid the confusion. With little equipment, and no clear command structure, they followed the sound of gunfire and cries for help, searching for any place that could be turned into a medical station. The village of Angoville-au-Plain appeared through the morning mist, a handful of stone buildings clustered around a single medieval church. Smoke rose from nearby hedgerows where paratroopers had exchanged fire with German patrols of the 91st Air Landing Division. Bodies lay among the hedges, and wounded men called out for aid. The medics worked where they could, dragging the injured into shallow cover, bandaging wounds with strips of torn parachute silk, and giving morphine to those in agony. but the fighting was spreading quickly. The small lanes and open fields offered no protection, and more casualties were arriving with every minute. They needed shelter, a structure strong enough to resist shrapnel and visible enough for others to bring the wounded to. When Moore and Wright reached the Church of Saints Côme and Damien, they saw at once that it could serve this purpose. Its thick stone walls had withstood centuries of storms and now shielded them from small arms fire. Inside, the pews were intact, and the nave provided space for stretchers. It was close to the main road and accessible from multiple directions, which made it ideal as a collection point for the injured. The medics entered cautiously, stepping over fragments of plaster and glass, and assessed the damage. The roof was cracked but still held. The interior smelled of dust, wood, and faint traces of incense. They decided that this church would become their aid station. Moore unfurled a Red Cross flag and hung it near the entrance, visible from the road. It was a silent declaration of neutrality, a signal that within these walls there would be no shooting, no orders, no sides, only the work of saving lives. It was not a decision sanctioned by command, but in the fluid battlefront of D-Day, there was no one to ask for approval. They simply acted on instinct and on the oath they carried within themselves. The first wounded men arrived soon after. Some were carried in by paratroopers, others stumbled in on their own, leaving trails of blood across the threshold. The medics cleared pews to make room for stretchers, using wooden benches as makeshift operating tables. They placed the most gravely wounded near the altar, where the light was better. Water was scarce, so they sent local villagers, mostly elderly men and women who had emerged from cellars after the gunfire paused, to fetch buckets from nearby wells. The villagers returned despite the danger, crossing open ground under sporadic sniper fire to bring back what little water they could. Others tore up sheets and curtains from their homes to provide bandages. Before long, the church filled with the sounds of pain and effort. The air grew hot and thick, heavy with sweat, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood. Outside, the battle continued relentlessly, with machine gun bursts echoing off the stone walls. But inside, the rules of war began to shift. German soldiers, too, were carried in, some by their comrades, others by American paratroopers who refused to let them die unattended. The Red Cross flag hanging above the doorway commanded a rare respect. Both sides honored it, understanding that this small patch of ground had become something apart from the battlefield. By midday, the church at Angoville-au-Plain had transformed into an island of mercy amid destruction. For Moore and Wright, there was no time to reflect on what they had done. Their hands were shaking from exhaustion, and their uniforms were soaked with blood, but they continued to work, improvising solutions to every shortage. Their decision to claim the church as neutral ground had given the wounded a chance to live and given the village a fragile reprieve from war. This moment, the transformation of an ancient church into a sanctuary, became the quiet catalyst that defined the story of Angoville-au-Plain. In a landscape governed by orders and violence, two men had made a choice rooted not in strategy, but in compassion. And against all odds, that choice held. Inside the Church of Saints Côme and Damien, the two American medics began the slow, deliberate process of turning a place of worship into a field hospital. The transformation happened under constant pressure, as the sounds of gunfire and explosions outside echoed through the heavy stone walls. Kenneth J. Moore and Robert E. Wright had no official supplies beyond what they had carried during their jump. The medical bundles that had been dropped with parachutes were scattered across miles of flooded fields and enemy positions. What they had was what they could carry in their hands: bandages, sulfa powder, morphine, a few ampoules of plasma, and a surgeon's kit no larger than a shoebox. Everything else had to be improvised. The first task was to clear space. Debris, splintered wood, and broken glass littered the floor. Moore and Wright pushed the pews aside, creating narrow aisles where the wounded could be laid down. The wooden benches were heavy, but solid enough to serve as makeshift operating tables once cleared. They removed fallen plaster from the nave and swept away fragments of stained glass that still glittered from the shattered windows. In the apse, where sunlight filtered through a cracked window, they set up their central work area, what would serve as their surgery and triage zone. The altar itself, still intact, became the table for the gravely wounded. Its flat surface, covered with a cloth from the sacristy, provided a rare level area where they could perform emergency procedures, stopping arterial bleeding, extracting fragments, resetting bones, or administering morphine. Nearby, they arranged plasma bottles on wooden supports, hanging them from cords torn from parachute lines. The cords swayed gently in the air whenever the church trembled from nearby detonations. The villagers who had returned after the first wave of fighting brought what little they had: linen, candles, water, and buckets. The medics tore the linen into strips for bandages and sterilized them as best they could with alcohol scavenged from abandoned German medical kits. When the candles ran low, they used flashlights and lanterns taken from paratrooper equipment, wedging them between stones to illuminate the operating space. Their light flickered across faces, instruments, and the crimson-stained floor. By midday, the pews were lined with men in various stages of shock and pain. The groans of the wounded mingled with the distant rumble of artillery. The church had become a living organism, its air thick with heat and breath, its walls pulsing with the rhythm of battle outside. Moore and Wright worked in silence, communicating through gestures and brief glances. They prioritized the worst cases first, those who might survive only if treated immediately. When morphine ran low, they halved doses. When plasma was gone, they relied on water and prayer. Every decision had to balance compassion with necessity. Outside, the Red Cross flag that Moore had tied to the doorway flapped in the wind. It marked the church as neutral ground, a signal that somehow survived amid chaos. Several times, shells exploded nearby, shaking dust from the ceiling. Yet the flag remained, and remarkably, both American and German troops respected it. German soldiers carried their own wounded to the door and left them there without crossing the threshold armed. American paratroopers did the same. For brief moments, the fighting seemed to pause around this building, as if its centuries-old stones still commanded respect that neither side could explain. As the hours passed, the work grew harder. Blood soaked into the wooden floors, mixing with candle wax and rainwater that seeped through holes in the roof. The medics' hands blistered and trembled, their uniforms stiffened with dried blood. They used parachute fabric as sheets to cover the dead, stacking bodies near the entrance to make room for the living. Despite exhaustion, they maintained a fragile order. The wounded were sorted, stabilized, and either left to rest or moved closer to the altar for urgent care. Through all of it, the structure held. The medieval masonry, designed centuries earlier to withstand storms and time, now shielded the living from modern war. The echoes of gunfire outside could not erase the silence of purpose that had settled within the church. In that fragile refuge, medicine and faith intertwined, not in words or rituals, but in the simple persistence of care. The Red Cross flag at the door became more than a symbol. It became a line between chaos and civilization, between the will to destroy and the will to heal. For 2 full days, the small stone church of Angoville-au-Plain remained a living island of struggle and endurance. Inside, medics Kenneth J, Moore and Robert E. Wright worked without pause, their world reduced to a few square meters of stone, blood, and fading light. Between the 6th and 7th of June, they treated roughly 80 wounded men, Americans, Germans, and even one local French child who had been caught in the crossfire. Each life carried into the church added to the weight of exhaustion that pressed down on them, yet neither stopped. The rhythm of their work followed the rhythm of survival. Every few minutes another paratrooper or villager arrived at the doorway, carried on makeshift stretchers made of doors, shutters, or parachute frames. The medics triaged automatically, their minds stripped to instinct. The most urgent cases went to the altar: chest wounds, shattered limbs, deep lacerations, burns from exploding shells. Moore stabilized breathing with morphine and bandages soaked in sulfa powder, while Wright managed transfusions, using plasma bottles scavenged from lost supply drops. When plasma ran out, they used saline water, adjusted by guesswork. Precision medicine was impossible. Survival depended on improvisation. The villagers who dared to help continued to bring buckets of water and strips of linen, though the road to the well was under intermittent fire. Some of them returned trembling, their clothes wet and torn from crawling through ditches. Inside the church, the medics sterilized instruments over small alcohol burners, cleaned wounds with iodine when it was available, and used candlelight to check for fractures or foreign objects. Their hands never stopped moving. They bound wounds, applied tourniquets, and whispered quiet words of reassurance that blurred into the noise of the dying. Among the wounded were paratroopers from the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, German infantrymen from the 91st Air Landing Division, and civilians from nearby farms. The fighting outside came in waves, intense exchanges of machine gun and mortar fire followed by brief silences. Each time the silence came, more bodies appeared at the door. The Red Cross flag continued to flutter, and remarkably it held its protection. On several occasions, German soldiers brought their own injured to the threshold and left them there, trusting the Americans to do what was right. No weapons crossed the doorframe. Within those walls, nationality and allegiance ceased to matter. The child, a boy of about 10, had been found in the rubble of a nearby house. He was unconscious, his leg crushed by falling masonry. Wright cleaned the wound and stabilized it with splints made from rifle stocks, while Moore covered him with a parachute for warmth. The boy survived, though his parents did not. His quiet breathing became one of the few moments that reminded the medics of what they were truly fighting for. By the second night, fatigue blurred the edges of time. Both men had gone nearly 40 hours without rest. Their uniforms were soaked through with sweat and blood, their eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. The air inside the church had grown foul with the smell of antiseptic, damp wood, and decay. Rain leaked through holes in the roof, dripping steadily onto the floor and mixing with blood to form a dark film. The medics worked through it, moving automatically, their thoughts fixed only on the next pulse, the next breath, the next wound to close. When elements of the 501st finally secured the area around Angoville-au-Plain on June 7th, reinforcements arrived to relieve them. Soldiers stepping into the church were struck by the scene, rows of wounded lying side by side, some asleep, others staring silently at the ceiling, the floor streaked with red and black stains, 2 men standing amidst the wreckage, their hands trembling but still working. Moore and Wright had not eaten in over a day. When a new medic tried to take over, they refused to stop until every remaining casualty had been treated or moved to safety. Their courage did not end with the battle. After the front moved eastward, reports of their work circulated through the 101st Airborne and beyond. The command of the U.S. Army recognized both medics with the Silver Star for gallantry in action, a rare honor for men whose weapons were only bandages and compassion. The citation described how, under constant enemy fire and without rest or resupply, they established and maintained an aid station that treated dozens of wounded from both sides, saving countless lives. When the fighting finally ceased in the village, the church fell quiet again. The flag of the Red Cross still hung at the doorway, stained and torn but unbroken, a silent witness to the 2 days when war paused long enough for mercy to take its place. The story of Angoville-au-Plain spread quietly but powerfully through the ranks of the 101st Airborne and across the broader Allied front in Normandy. News of 2 medics who had turned a 12th-century church into a sanctuary where both friend and enemy received care resonated deeply with soldiers who had seen little mercy since the invasion began. Within days, officers and medical corpsmen began to recognize the tactical and moral value of what Moore and Wright had done. Their example showed that a single stable structure, if protected and respected, could serve as a lifeline for hundreds trapped between advancing and retreating lines. Across Normandy, similar stories began to unfold. In the hedgerow villages near Corentin, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and Saint-Côme-du-Mont, paratrooper medics and engineers worked together to adapt surviving buildings for medical use. Stone barns, schoolhouses, chapels, and even abandoned railway depots became temporary aid stations. The principle was simple but vital: find shelter, establish neutrality, and improvise. Engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion and infantry support units helped clear rubble, shore up weakened walls, and run electrical cables from portable generators so surgeons could operate after dark. The experience of Angoville had proven that even in a landscape shattered by artillery, fragments of the old world could still serve the needs of the living. Further south, near St. Lo and Coutances, the same logic was applied on a larger scale. By July, As the Allies advanced through the devastated towns of the Cotentin Peninsula, engineer battalions such as the 148th and 300th Combat Engineers were tasked with making damaged structures usable again. In St. Lo, almost 90% of the city had been destroyed by Allied bombing, but its basements and cellars became emergency shelters. Engineers cleared debris, built wooden supports, and installed makeshift ventilation systems so that medical teams could work safely beneath the ruins. Their tools were shovels, beams, and sandbags rather than scalpels, yet their labor was as critical to saving lives as any surgical act. The concept of adaptive field medicine, using local infrastructure rather than waiting for pre-planned facilities, spread through the U.S. First Army's Medical Corps. Commanders issued informal guidance encouraging the use of surviving stone buildings as triage and holding points whenever conditions allowed. This approach shortened evacuation times dramatically, especially in regions where roads were cratered or flooded. Engineers and medics began to collaborate routinely. Engineers built ramps for stretchers, reinforced floors to hold heavy surgical tables, and provided lighting and sanitation. The battlefield was teaching them that survival depended not only on courage, but on flexibility. Angoville's example also influenced how local civilians were integrated into the process. French villagers, who had at first hidden from the fighting, became active participants in the care of the wounded, guided by the precedents set in that church. In towns like La Haye-du-Puits and Perriers, local women served as nurses and interpreters, while engineers organized wells and pump systems to ensure clean water for surgery and sanitation. The cooperation between soldiers and civilians created a model of improvised humanitarian response that persisted through the liberation of France and into later campaigns in Belgium and Germany. By late summer 1944, as Allied forces broke through the German lines during Operation Cobra, field medicine and combat engineering had become inseparable disciplines. Engineers built bridges and roads not only for tanks but for ambulances and hospital convoys. They reinforced barns to serve as mobile surgical units, and installed drainage to prevent infection in muddy encampments. The spirit of Angoville, the idea that healing could exist within destruction, had become part of the unspoken doctrine of the advancing armies. When word of Moore and Wright's actions reached higher command, their names appeared in after-action reports and division bulletins. Their work was cited not merely as an act of bravery but as a demonstration of initiative under fire, a model of what small units could accomplish when conventional systems failed. The lesson was absorbed by engineers, medics, and officers alike. The line between destruction and preservation was not fixed, it could be redrawn by human hands. After the war, the Church of Saints Côme and Damien in Angoville-au-Plain stood exactly as the medics had left it, scarred, silent, and still carrying the marks of those desperate days in June 1944. The villagers did not rebuild or repaint its walls. They chose instead to preserve it as it was, an unintentional memorial carved by the events that had unfolded within. The pews remained in place, their wood darkened by the stains of blood that no amount of cleaning could remove. Bullet holes marked the outer walls, and the flagstone floor bore scratches where stretchers and boots had dragged the wounded across it. Over time, the church became not only a house of worship again, but a living testament to the fragile peace that can exist even in the center of war. For years after the liberation, the story of the medics Kenneth J, Moore and Robert E. Wright was known mostly among veterans and the people of the Cotentin Peninsula. In the post-war rebuilding of France, when so many towns had to be razed and reconstructed from rubble, Angoville was one of the few villages where the most important building, the church, was left intentionally untouched. Local families continued to gather there for Mass, surrounded by traces of the battle that had once raged outside its doors. The villagers called it L'Église des Parachutistes, the Church of the Paratroopers. By the 1950s and 1960s, as the memory of the war began to fade in many parts of Europe, pilgrims and veterans associations from the United States started returning to Normandy to visit the D-Day sites. Angoville-au-Plain was never among the major destinations. It had no monuments or cemeteries, only a quiet church surrounded by hedgerows. But those who came often spoke of it afterward as the most human sight on the entire front. The power of the place lay not in grand memorials or military triumphs but in its stillness, the realization that mercy had existed here, not victory. In later decades, the Commune worked with American veterans organizations and the 101st Airborne Division Association to ensure the church was preserved properly. The original pews, still marked with bloodstains, were never replaced. A simple plaque was added inside the nave bearing the inscription, "To save one life is to save the world entire." Above it, a framed photograph of Moore and Wright was placed by visiting paratroopers from the division they had served. The gesture was understated, in keeping with the nature of their actions. No medals or flags dominated the space, only quiet remembrance. In 2004, to mark the 60th anniversary of D-Day, new stained glass windows were installed. They depicted parachutes descending over the Norman countryside and the emblem of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagle, set among beams of blue and gold light. The windows were a gift from American veterans and their families, designed to blend with the medieval architecture rather than replace it. The light that now filtered through them fell across the same pews where wounded men had once lain, binding the past and present in a single frame of color. Each year, on the anniversary of the Normandy landings, ceremonies are held at Angoville-au-Plain. Veterans from both nations, local residents, and serving members of the 101st Airborne attend to honor the two medics and the spirit of the church. Wreaths are laid at the altar, and the American and French flags hang side by side outside the doorway where the Red Cross flag once fluttered. The ceremonies are simple, free of military display, emphasizing instead the unity of purpose that transcended sides and borders. Today, the church remains one of the most authentic and quietly powerful memorials of the Normandy campaign. It stands not as a monument to conquest but as a sanctuary to conscience. Visitors who step inside often describe the same sensation, a feeling of reverence mixed with disbelief that something so gentle could have survived something so brutal. The faint marks on the pews, the patched holes in the stone, the lingering scent of old wood and wax all speak of a moment when humanity, if only briefly, overcame war. The story of Angoville-au-Plain endured as one of those rare moments when the brutality of war revealed its opposite. In the middle of destruction, it showed that compassion could exist without command, and that moral courage did not depend on rank or weapon. Two medics, alone and exhausted, had transformed the meaning of their surroundings. The church that once served faith now served mercy. Its ancient stones, blackened by fire and shrapnel, became witnesses to an idea older than war itself, the duty to preserve life even when the world demanded otherwise. What happened inside that small Norman church challenged the logic of total war. On D-Day, humanity was measured by force, by precision, by how much ground could be taken before sunset. Yet within those few square meters of sanctuary, victory meant something else entirely. It meant keeping one more man alive through the night. The boundaries that armies drew across the fields dissolved inside those walls. Enemy and ally became indistinguishable once the uniforms were soaked in the same blood. In the most violent moment of the 20th century, Angoville became an exception, a fragile pause in which men remembered what it meant to be human. The legacy of that decision reached beyond Normandy. For those who heard the story afterward, soldiers, medics, and civilians alike, it carried an unspoken question: what is worth protecting when everything else is falling apart? The answer was not found in strategies or orders but in the silent work of two men who refused to let hatred dictate their actions. They proved that the simplest act, bandaging a wound, sharing water, refusing to abandon the enemy, could be as revolutionary as any military triumph. The power of that moment lay not in its scale, but in its defiance of the world around it. In historical memory, Angoville-au-Plain became more than a place. It became a metaphor for the limits of destruction. The church still stood because its builders, centuries earlier, had laid its foundation in stone. But the medics who worked inside laid another kind of foundation, one made of moral endurance. They built something invisible yet lasting, a belief that war could never fully erase the capacity for decency. That belief survived long after the soldiers left, long after the wounds healed, long after the noise of guns had faded into the wind that moves through the hedgerows. The story also revealed something about faith, not the religious faith expressed in prayer, but the human faith in connection, in the idea that every life matters even when the world denies it. The Church did not perform a miracle in the divine sense, it performed a human one. It became a space where people from opposing armies trusted that their suffering would be acknowledged, where compassion became the only remaining order. In the ruins of Europe, such moments were rare, but they reminded those who witnessed them that morality was not entirely lost. For generations after the war, visitors who entered the church described the same quiet realization that peace is not a permanent condition granted by treaties or victories. It is built moment by moment, person by person, in choices made under pressure. Moore and Wright's decision to heal indiscriminately stood as a model for that fragile peace. It was not heroic in the cinematic sense, but it carried a deeper strength, the strength to resist the machinery of destruction through the persistence of care. Angoville-au-Plain remained, therefore, not just a chapter of D-Day history but a moral lesson written in stone and blood. It showed that even amid organized violence, the individual still had the power to choose creation over ruin. The Church's survival was not only architectural but symbolic. It stood as proof that compassion, once born, could endure longer than any campaign, any ideology, or any war.